Hello everyone, welcome to my fourth video, ebook 2.3, Invoice Receipt and Verification in Accounts Receivable. In earlier three videos, we learned about what is the basics of accounts payable, what is the vendor master process, and what is the PO process. In this is the kind of fourth step. We'll talk about invoice receipt and verification process in accounts payable. Through this video, we'll learn about what is invoice receipt and verification process, what are the various invoice receipt methods, what is the key information that should be available on the invoice, what is the three-way and two-way matching process, what are the invoice validation checks, how do you handle mismatch and some of the exceptions, what are the tools for invoice processing, compliance and consideration that should be done, what are the best practices, and finally we'll talk about what are the expected interview questions from this content. Invoice receipt and verification is a critical AP sub process where invoices received from supplier are validated for accuracy, compliance validation, and authorization before being booked into accounting system. One of the common question that you can expect from the invoice process is what is invoice receipt and verification process. The way it can be explained is this process includes receiving the vendor invoices, checking for compliance with purchase terms, matching with the corresponding documents like PO and GRN, and ensuring it is ready for payment before it is booked into the system. Now let's talk about what are the various ways of receiving an invoice. The simplest way of receiving an invoice is through an email where the supplier sends you an email with the invoice copy. The second way is supplier portal uploads, where this is a self-service model where supplier uploads the invoices in their portal and the receiver logs into the portal and download the invoices. The third way, and this is the efficient way, is called EDI, electronic data interface, where there is a data interface between both supplier and the purchaser. The information is electronically passed from one system to the other system. And last but not the least is physical submission. This is the scanned manual invoices, which means there is a physical copy that is scanned and a physical copy is delivered. There are some countries where submitting a physical copy is mandate. So this is also one of the key way of receiving the invoices. Now we'll talk about invoice format and the basic requirements. Some of the important invoice information which need to be mentioned on the invoices: legal supplier name and address. If this information is not there, the invoice is not considered as compliant. The second is invoice number and the invoice date, PO number in case applicable, itemized goods and services, which means the invoice should clearly mention the list of items that is received, the list of quantities that is received or sent. And next is the tax details like GST, VAT, and all related tax information are mandatory. And then finally, the total invoice amount that is due. In this video, we'll again talk about what is a three-way and a two-way matching process. Three-way match, like I explained in my previous video, it is an invoice, purchase order, and goods receipt match, which means you get an invoice, you tie it back to a purchase order, and then you also tie it back to the GRN in your ERP system. And the other is two-way match, where invoice and purchase order are matched. Two-way match is invoice just matching with the purchase order. There is no GRN entry in this process. When you are processing an invoice, what are the important validations that someone should be doing? First one is duplicate invoice check. You should always make sure that the invoice is not enter duplicately, which means uh, if you process a duplicate invoice, there's a potential chances of making two payments for just one invoice. The other validation is price and quantity validation. You should look at your PO price versus your PO uh, quantity. Then you should make sure that the invoice clearly matches the PO. And then third one is PO reference verification, which means uh, the PO number should be mentioned on the invoice and you should match it with your ERP system. And the fourth one is tax computation accuracy, which means you should clearly validate the percentage of tax that is being invoiced for. Then finally, due dates and payment terms. Due dates and payment terms are also very important. If you agree to a payment term, then payment term like 30 days, the invoice should be due after 30 days. And if there is a mismatch, there are potential chances of you making the payment early. How do you handle mismatch and exceptions? The way you can handle is if there is an invoice, you hold the invoice for a clarification, which means you do not process it in the system. Or even if you process it in the system, you should manually put and hold until you have the clarification. And then raise the exception in the ERP workflow. There are systems where the exceptions can be raised and it follows a workflow, either approval or a clarification process that need to be sought. Talk with the vendor or the procurement team for resolution. There are some cases where there are mismatches, there are offline alignments, and then you are you have to talk to your vendor or the purchasing team to understand how do you resolve. And the final step is document resolution and approval before posting, which means you need to make sure you have enough document uh, supporting the invoice and it should follow the approval process before it is posted in the system. What are the common tools for invoice processing? Some of the very well known tools are SOP, Oracle, NetSuite. These are some of the top tools where the invoice can be processed. And the second one is OCR software for scanning physical invoices. What is OCR? I will make a detailed video on what is OCR all about. But simplest for your understanding is OCR is a system where it can read the scanned information and create an output for you, which can be processed. Third one is workflow tools for approvals, which can be done through baseware and some of the tools like Coupa, which means you process an invoice, it goes to a workflow, and it has to be approved by the respective business owners or procurement owners or finance teams. Fourth one is RPA boards for auto extraction and validation of data. What are the compliance consideration that should be done when an invoice is processing? You should always make sure that local tax compliance guidelines are followed, which means um, the invoice that you are receiving should follow the tax compliance. It should contain the GST or VAT number, etc. It should have a clear audit trail of changes and approvals, which means if there are such changes done to the invoice, it should follow the approval process and then audit trail need to be tracked. Retention of invoice records. This is one of the important component for many countries where a retention of invoice is mandatory, which means there are some countries where it is important for you to retain the physical invoices or the soft copy as invoices. For some countries has 10 years of mandate for us to keep a invoice record. Let's talk about some of the best practices that we need to follow. Standardized invoice template for vendors, which means you should always expect a vendor to submit the invoice in a standardized template where the respective information is available without any misses. Second one is use OCR and automation for faster processing. The manual invoice definitely takes longer processing time, and because it is manual, it is prone to errors. So it is advisable to use automations and technologies like OCR, which is faster and accurate way of processing invoices. Third important part is configure tolerance limits for auto approvals. I'll give you an example what is tolerance all about. For example, you have an invoice for 10,000 US dollars and the variance is just few cents. So just for few cents, the expectation is that you don't reject the invoice in full. There should be a basic tolerance available for the invoice processing. Without tolerance, there are potential chances that you will keep accumulating the invoices for very small variances which can be ignored. And the final step is train team to identify invoice fraud, which means there are very good potential chances that you will keep getting duplicate invoices or fraud invoices through multiple channels. So it is important for the person who's processing the invoice. He's got enough knowledge, he's got enough training to make sure that he identifies the duplicates and fraudulent invoices that are trying to pass through your system. Now, most importantly, the section that you are waiting for, what are the top few interview questions that you can expect from this section? What if a vendor doesn't mention the PO number on the invoice? It is very important for the invoice to contain a PO number. The way you can answer is route to procurement or raise a non-PO workflow, which means if if the invoice does not require a PO, then you should follow the workflow path. And if you expect the PO to be mentioned on the invoice, then clarify with your procurement team, and if not, reject the invoice back to the vendor, asking them to mention the PO number on the invoice. The second question that you can expect is how do you avoid duplicate invoices? Like I explained a couple of times in my earlier videos and even in this video, it is important for us to make sure that there is no duplicate invoice processing. Most of the ERP systems that you have, there are flags for duplicate invoices. Some of the flags are like if you process an invoice with the same invoice number, the system triggers an alert for you to manually verify before it is processing. And there are some vendors who always keep sending duplicate invoices. So there are alerts in the system where the ERP triggers a notification or uh, ask you to hold and validate before you process the invoice. So it is very important to not to ignore the flags or alerts that is getting created by the ERP system before processing an invoice. Third question is, can AP reject invoices? Definitely yes. If the invoice is non-compliant, if the invoice does not have required information, if the invoice missing the PO number, if the invoice does not contain GST, VAT details, etc., the AP teams have all rights to reject the invoice. The way you can answer is yes, but with proper documentation and routing to the procurement or vendor, which means when you reject the vendor, it is very important for us to clarify what is the reason for this invoice rejection. For example, you are rejecting an invoice for PO not being mentioned. You can't just reject an invoice without any documentation or without any comment. It is important for us to reject the invoice and letting know the vendor that hey, this invoice is rejected because there is no PO number mentioned on it, or you say this invoice is rejected because the address is missing, the contact details are missing. So likewise, it is very important for us to communicate back to the vendor primarily the reason why the invoice is being rejected. So finally, conclusion of this video: the proper invoice receipt and verification process helps prevent incorrect payment, ensure accuracy, and support financial reporting accuracy. Automating this process increases controls, increases the turnaround time, and minimize the disputes. Thank you for watching this full video. Subscribe to my channel for more videos coming ahead.